The SEAL captain slammed the table. "Is there a combat pilot here?" The room froze. Dozens of hardened warriors stayed silent until one young lieutenant quietly stood. No medals on her chest, no reputation to shield her, just calm eyes and 2,000 hours of flight time. What happened next would flip every doubt upside down. She'd take off into impossible mountains, thread her aircraft through storms and gunfire, and hold 4 lives in her hands when no one else dared. This isn't just a flight. It's a fight against time, fear, and death itself. Stay tuned, because you're about to hear how one decision changed everything. This is VeteranBiker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. Gunfire shredded the tree line before the smoke from the explosion had even cleared. The helicopter lay broken in the valley below, tail twisted into the rocks, one rotor blade embedded like a spear into the soil. Men crawled from the wreckage, coughing, dragging each other across scorched dirt. Their cries were drowned by the whistle of incoming rounds. Enemy fighters had already closed in, spraying bullets through the mist of burning fuel. One soldier raised a rifle with trembling hands, loosing desperate bursts toward shadows moving in the undergrowth, but he knew they were outnumbered. A flare sputtered into the grey sky, trailing sparks that fizzled against the mountainside. It wasn't a signal of victory, it was a plea. Back at Red Haven, the warning klaxons tore through the dawn. The naval station seemed to jolt awake in unison. Boots hammered across asphalt, doors slammed, engines spun up. Over the PA system, a clipped voice ordered all personnel to muster. The air smelled of jet fuel and ozone, the whole base vibrating with a sense that something catastrophic was unfolding beyond the ridgeline. Captain David Riker stormed into the briefing hall, documents clenched in his fist. He wasn't a man known for theatrics, but the way he flung the satellite photo across the steel table told everyone the situation was critical. The projected image filled the wall, jagged mountains, thick canopy, a smudge of smoke curling from a scar on the forest floor. "They're alive," he said, voice sharp, "but they're surrounded." His words cracked through the low murmur of voices, silencing even the most hardened officers. Around the room, aviators and Marines shifted in their seats. The silence was heavy, the kind that pressed on the chest. They all understood what Riker was asking without him needing to spell it out. Someone had to fly into that valley, someone had to thread through anti-aircraft nests and narrow passes, someone had to gamble their life for the 4 trapped men. Grace sat at the edge of the room, her palms flat on her knees, heart pounding so hard she thought the others might hear it. The faces around her were lined with unease, some refusing to meet Riker's gaze. He demanded again, louder this time, "Who's willing to take this mission?" No one stood. The weight of the silence cut deeper than the sirens outside. Eyes darted, shoes scuffed the floor, but no voices rose. Grace inhaled through her nose, steady, and then she did what instinct demanded. She pushed back her chair and rose. The scrape of metal legs on tile drew every head. Conversation stopped mid-breath. Riker's eyes locked on her, narrowing. Colonel Marcus Dalton, leaning against the wall with arms crossed, straightened abruptly. "Lieutenant," he said, tone edged with disbelief, "do you have any idea what this involves?" Grace didn't flinch. She stepped forward, boots firm against the floor, and reached for the projected map. Her hand traced a serrated ridgeline on the image. "Here," she said evenly, "the terrain masks radar sweeps. It gives me a corridor in, low, fast, hugging the slope." Murmurs rose. Major Blake Saunders, a broad-shouldered pilot with years etched into his face, leaned forward. "I've got more hours in combat airspace than you, Torres," he snapped, deliberately using her last name as if to anchor his point. "If anyone's going, it should be me." Grace kept her eyes on the map. Flying low through those valleys isn't about experience measured in years. It's about control, discipline, and calm under pressure. I know the aircraft's limits down to the last rivet. I can keep it alive in terrain that swallows bigger birds whole." Her words weren't boastful. They were delivered like coordinates, precise and cold. The room shifted. Even those who doubted her couldn't ignore the certainty in her voice. Dalton's jaw tightened. "You'll be flying alone into hostile territory. There's no second chance. If you're shot down, we lose you and the mission." Grace's gaze lifted from the map, her eyes locking on his. "Sir, with respect, those men are already living on borrowed time. They don't need hesitation. They need a pilot who'll commit." The tension broke like a gunshot. Voices clashed, some officers objecting, others grudgingly impressed. Saunders slammed a hand against the table, demanding the mission, but Riker raised his palm, silencing the storm. His gaze swept across both pilots, weighing something deeper than flight hours or rank. He pointed at Grace. "Walk me through it, step by step." She moved closer to the projection, finger gliding over contours, valleys, tree cover. "Approach from the northwest. Use the prevailing winds to conserve fuel. This route avoids their heavier gun emplacements. The ridgeline here blocks line of sight until I'm almost overhead. Once I reach the valley, I can use tree canopy for concealment while searching for the survivor's signal. Communication will be short bursts, coded to minimize interception." Her tone was calm, surgical. She accounted for weather patterns, crosswinds, emergency landing sites, even the probability of ground fire at choke points. Every contingency had a plan. The longer she spoke, the quieter the room became. Even Dalton's skepticism faltered under the weight of her preparation. When she finished, Riker folded his arms, studying her like he was seeing her for the first time. Seconds ticked by, each heavier than the last. Then he nodded once. "You've got the mission. 2 hours. Wheels up." The announcement cracked through the hall like a verdict. Saunders' mouth tightened, but he said nothing more. Dalton exhaled, a slow release of tension, and turned away. Grace didn't celebrate. She simply dipped her head, a nod of acknowledgement, then pivoted on her heel. Outside, the base roared with activity. Technicians hauled crates of gear, mechanics swarmed over aircraft, Marines jogged in formation toward transports. Grace pushed through the chaos, the smell of fuel sharp in the air. Her focus narrowed on one thing: the stripped-down reconnaissance plane waiting under the floodlights. Chief Petty Officer Lewis Grant was already there, grease on his hands, clipboard tucked under one arm. He glanced up as she approached, reading her expression before she spoke. "So it's you," he said quietly. "It's me," she replied. He nodded once without question, then gestured toward the plane. "We've pulled every ounce of weight we could, fuel loads optimized, navigation systems been tweaked for terrain masking. But you'll be running lean, no margin for mistakes." Grace climbed onto the ladder, fingertips brushing the fuselage as though grounding herself. The metal was cool, humming faintly from the generators. Inside the cockpit, dials and switches gleamed, waiting. She lowered herself into the seat, breathing in the scent of oil and worn leather, and began the ritual she knew by heart. Checklists, calibrations, cross-checks. Grant leaned in over her shoulder. "You know they've been listening in. Intercepts suggest enemy patrols are already shifting toward likely flight paths. They'll be expecting someone." Grace flicked a switch, gauges flickering to life. "Then I'll give them something they don't expect." The canopy hissed shut above her head, sealing her inside. The world narrowed to instruments and resolve. Through the glass, she could see figures gathering on the edge of the flight line, personnel who had no role in this mission but couldn't look away. She rolled her shoulders, gripped the control column, and exhaled slowly. The countdown had begun. 2 hours to lift off, 2 hours to carry 4 strangers' lives on her wings, 2 hours before she faced the valley of fire alone. The alarm klaxons still echoed across the base, but for Grace, the noise had faded. What remained was the weight of silence. The silence that had filled the briefing room before she stood. The silence of men doubting her. The silence she intended to break with the roar of engines cutting into hostile sky. The engines across Redhaven Naval Air Station growled like a caged storm. Searchlights swept the tarmac, striking beams across hangars where crewmen raced with armloads of equipment. It was less a base preparing for a mission than a hive on the edge of panic, except for the slender figure climbing down from the cockpit of the stripped reconnaissance aircraft. Grace's boots hit the concrete with the solid finality of someone who had already decided she would fly, and she would come back, or she would not come back at all. Captain Riker strode across the floodlit ramp to meet her. He carried a folder thick with updated intel, but his eyes were on her, measuring. "We don't have time for second thoughts," he said flatly. "Good," Grace answered, tugging her gloves tighter. "I didn't bring any." Inside the operations center, the air smelled of stale coffee and hot electronics. The map had been replaced with a scrolling stream of intercepted transmissions. Enemy units were already moving, their chatter spiking as if they sensed prey. Colonel Dalton loomed over the console, jaw set. He looked at Grace the way a man looks at a fuse about to be lit. "Listen carefully, Lieutenant," he said, voice low but hard. "They'll be listening for you. Every frequency we use, every pattern we fly, they'll be waiting. This is a gauntlet, not a flight plan. Do you understand?" Grace kept her gaze level. "I understand, which is why I'll change the rules the second I'm airborne." The room went still for a heartbeat, officers trading glances. Riker gave the faintest ghost of a grin. "That's what I wanted to hear." The briefing ran like rapid gunfire. Coordinates flashed, weather reports scrolled, threat assessments barked. Grace absorbed it all, building a map in her head of every ridge, every pocket of turbulence, every likely ambush point. She didn't ask for repetition, she didn't need to. Then came the test. Major Saunders stepped forward, his tone clipped with the weight of years. "Let's stop playing," he said. "This mission is suicide. I've flown combat valleys from Kandahar to Korangal, and even I wouldn't thread that canyon in a stripped bird." "What makes you think you'll survive?" The room bristled. No one contradicted Saunders lightly. Grace turned toward him, her face calm but her eyes burning. "Because survival isn't the mission. Extraction is. If I come back without them, it won't matter how pretty my maneuvers were." The words hit harder than any boast could. For a moment, even Saunders had nothing to add. The countdown ticked, 1 hour until launch. Grace moved through the hangar with Chief Grant at her side, both weaving through mechanics and armorers in synchronized urgency. Fuel lines hissed, tool carts rattled, the ground crew shouting checks back and forth like a chorus. The aircraft itself crouched under the lights like a predatory bird, sleek, stripped of anything not essential, painted in dull gray that swallowed the glare. Grant handed her a checklist. Every system's green. "But I'm telling you, Torres, you'll be flying a knife fight with a paper-thin margin. She'll handle like a dream, but if you push her wrong, she'll bite back." Grace scrawled her initials across the logbook. "Then I'll fly her like she's glass." He paused, studying her. "You don't look scared." "Of course I'm scared," she said, sliding her helmet under her arm. "That's why I'll pay attention." The clock burned down to 30 minutes. Out on the line, floodlights threw long shadows as more personnel gathered, drawn by the knowledge that they might be watching the last minutes of a pilot's life. Grace ignored the crowd, focused only on her final walk-around. She touched every control surface, every hinge, every panel, memorizing the plane's condition by feel as much as sight. It wasn't superstition, it was ritual, a way to ground herself before the storm. A runner arrived with the latest intercepts. Riker caught Grace by the arm, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "They've shifted artillery closer to the valley mouth. If you climb even 20 feet too high, they'll see you. You'll have one chance to slip past." Grace nodded. Then I won't climb 20 feet too high. He held her gaze another second, as though searching for cracks, then released her. Make sure you come back. That's an order. The final minutes snapped into focus. Grace donned her flight suit, gloves, helmet, each motion deliberate, each buckle sealed with the weight of finality. She climbed the ladder into the cockpit, sliding into the seat with the familiarity of 1,000 hours, but the gravity of knowing this might be her last. Grant's voice came through her headset as he leaned into the cockpit frame. Remember, if she starts to stall low, don't fight her. Let her float, then recover. She'll tell you what she needs if you're listening. Grace flicked switches, engines whining alive. I'll listen. The turbines wound up with a rising shriek that shook the concrete underfoot. Heat shimmered behind the exhaust, rippling the night air. Ground crew scrambled back, giving hand signals as Grace ran through controls, every response crisp, flawless. Red Haven Tower, this is Recon 01, she said into the mic, her voice steady. Requesting clearance for immediate departure. 01 Tower, cleared to taxi, runway 34, Godspeed. The aircraft lurched forward, wheels rolling, lights flashing across her canopy. She guided it along the taxiway, rows of mechanics and Marines saluting as she passed. Some crossed themselves, some just stared. She lined up on the runway, throttles advancing. The plane shivered, engines howling, hungry to be unleashed. Grace's pulse steadied. This was where she belonged. Not in a briefing room, not in a hangar, but here, on the razor's edge between earth and sky. She shoved the throttles forward. The roar swallowed everything. Concrete blurred beneath her, then dropped away as the bird leapt into darkness. The base fell behind in a scatter of lights. Ahead stretched nothing but mountains and storm. Grace leveled at treetop height, her hands firm, her mind clear. The mission had begun. The valley swallowed her whole. Grace dropped the reconnaissance plane so low that branches blurred against the canopy, a living green tunnel whipping past in a blur of color and shadow. Wind buffeted the fuselage, the kind that rattled bones as much as metal, but her hands stayed locked on the controls, firm without being rigid. Every second was a calculation. Altitude, thrust, angle, drift. Every second was the difference between threading the needle or slamming into granite. Her headset crackled, static rolled across the channel, then the clipped voice of Colonel Dalton forced its way through the interference. 01, you've crossed the boundary. Enemy surveillance expected ahead. Remember your altitude restrictions. Do not break cover. Grace flicked her mic on. Copy. Maintaining. She pushed the nose lower still, tracing the slope of a ravine. The aircraft responded like a living thing, protesting with subtle vibrations that warned how close she was flying to the edge of its envelope. She felt it in her spine, in the soles of her boots pressed to the rudder pedals, but beneath the pressure there was also clarity. She was alone now, beyond the reach of second-guessing. This was her world. The mountains loomed ahead, jagged and cruel, scarred by centuries of wind and stonefall. The only path was a series of razor-thin passes. She rolled left, hugging the face of a cliff until the sunlight vanished, swallowed by shadow. Her pulse matched the thrum of the engines. Then the first alarm shrieked across her console, radar ping. Enemy systems had swept the sky and brushed her flight path. Instinct snapped through her. She banked sharply, diving deeper into the ravine, treetops brushing her undercarriage. Leaves tore free in her wake. Through the canopy glass, the world narrowed to a seam of sky no wider than her wingspan. If she hesitated even a breath, she'd carve herself into the stone. Grace pressed her lips together and rode the turbulence. Another radar sweep. Stronger, closer. She slammed the throttles forward, engine roar clawing at her ears, and tucked the bird against the curve of the valley wall. The display flashed warnings: terrain proximity, stall risk, but she ignored them. Instead, she listened to the faint hum of the airframe, the subtle shudder that told her where the lift was, where the danger lay. Grant had been right. The plane would talk to her if she paid attention. Her screen lit again, 2 hostile aircraft low and fast, combing the corridor ahead. She had seconds to react. Climbing was suicide, running was worse. That left only one choice. She killed her lights, throttled back hard, and dropped into the shadow of an outcropping. The plane shuddered as airspeed bled, wings biting the edge of stall. For 3 heartbeats the aircraft all but hovered, suspended against physics. Grace held her breath. The enemy craft screamed past above her, engines howling, search beams cutting the canopy. One sweep carved across her position, so close the cockpit lit white. She forced her hands to remain still, resisting the instinct to jink away. If she moved, the reflection would give her away. The beam passed, the roar faded. Grace exhaled shakily and pushed the throttles forward again, coaxing the plane back into level flight. Sweat prickled under her collar, but her grip was steady. That was one gauntlet crossed. There would be more. Minutes stretched thin, each mile a lifetime. She skimmed across a valley floor, rivers flashing silver beneath her, then clawed back up a slope so steep the horizon disappeared. At the crest, a new hazard greeted her. Smoke columns, black and ugly, curling from camouflaged batteries dug into the ridgeline. Anti-aircraft fire erupted. Tracers stitched the air, bright slashes tearing through the morning haze. Grace yanked the stick, banking into a knife-edge turn that pressed her spine into the seat. The first bursts missed, the second didn't. A cluster of rounds rattled against her fuselage, sparks spitting off the wing. Warning lights blinked red, screaming of damage. She grit her teeth and rolled again, sliding the plane sideways down the slope of a mountain, using the terrain as her shield. The ground fire tried to follow, arcs of light cutting closer, but the ridgeline broke their sightline. She disappeared into the folds of earth, vanishing from their targeting screens. 0-1 status? Riker's voice broke through the static, clipped and urgent. Superficial hits, Grace replied. Aircraft still operational, continuing search. She didn't mention the cracked spider webbing across her canopy or the smell of scorched insulation. They were facts, not obstacles. Her eyes scanned the forest floor. She had reached the sector where the helicopter had gone down. Every detail mattered. The bent line of trees, the unnatural scar in the canopy, the faint smoke lingering between branches. And then she saw it, a glint half buried in green, a rotor blade jutting at an impossible angle, a shattered clearing scarred black. She banked low, circling tight, sensors sweeping. The wreckage was worse than she expected. Tail snapped, cockpit crumpled, debris scattered like broken bones. Yet in the undergrowth she spotted movement, figures hunched in camouflage, waving faintly toward the sky. Survivors. Her radio crackled again, faint and broken. "This is Echo Team. We copy. 4 alive. Low ammo." The voice was ragged, weak, but undeniable. Grace felt a rush of relief tempered by urgency. They were alive, but not for long. She swept another circle, sensors mapping enemy positions. Blips dotted her screen, hostile patrols tightening a noose around the clearing. Worse, she intercepted a transmission. Enemy forces directing artillery toward the crash site. The coordinates matched the valley floor where the survivors were hiding. Her knuckles whitened on the controls. If she delayed, the 4 men would be obliterated before any rescue reached them. If she rushed, she risked exposing her own position. There was no safe path. She clicked her mic. Command, survivors located, hostile forces closing, artillery inbound. I'll mark positions. Dalton's voice cut in sharp. -0-1, hold until ground team can coordinate. Grace's eyes flicked to the moving dots on her screen, each one representing enemy soldiers tightening the cordon. She thought of the weak voice crackling over the radio. Waiting meant death. "Command, I don't have time," she said flatly. "I'm moving in." Before anyone could argue, she rolled the aircraft into a dive. Trees whipped past, the plane skimming so low branches clawed at her wings. She fired a burst of flares, dazzling sensors, then released smoke markers in a bright red trail over the advancing enemy squads. Over the survivors' position, she dropped a coded beacon that pulsed on the SEAL team's comms, guiding them to the exact clearing. Her warning lights screamed again, radar locks from multiple sites. Enemy gunners had seen her, the air lit with tracer fire, streams of molten red chasing her tail. She jerked the plane into evasive maneuvers, rolling so violently her vision blurred at the edges. One burst clipped her left stabilizer. The plane lurched, alarms blaring, but she fought it level. The sound of tearing metal filled her ears, but the aircraft still answered, barely. 0-1, you're hit! Riker's shout was raw. Still flying, Grace snapped back. Targets marked. Send the team now! She climbed hard, tearing away from the valley floor, every muscle screaming under the G-force. Enemy fire tracked her ascent, but the smoke and flares masked her long enough to break lock. At the top of the climb, she leveled, panting, every nerve on fire. She glanced down once more, the survivors waving desperately, the enemy closing, the coded beacon blinking like a heartbeat. Her fuel gauge slid lower, her damage alarms pulsed. But she had done it. She had given them a fighting chance. Grace pressed her lips into a thin line. The mission wasn't over. It had only just begun. The mountains answered with thunder. It wasn't weather, it was artillery. Shells whistled from unseen batteries and smashed into the forest where Echo Team lay hidden. The ground convulsed, fire blossoming through the trees. Even from the cockpit, Grace could feel the concussions ripple through the air, shockwaves slamming against her fuselage. "Command, they're targeting the crash site," she shouted into her mic, eyes flicking between the smoke rising below and the gauges threatening in front of her. Colonel Dalton barked back, his voice iron but strained. "Ground element is en route. Hold position until they arrive." Grace clenched her jaw. Holding position meant watching those men die. She could already see figures scattering beneath the canopy, the survivors trying to crawl from one shredded foxhole to another while dirt and leaves rained down on their helmets. The noose was tightening, infantry squads were converging, artillery was zeroed in, and the four men had only minutes. She pressed the comms again. "Negative, I'm engaging now." Before Dalton's rebuke could reach her, she banked hard, diving toward the valley mouth. The reconnaissance plane was never meant to fight, but she had brains and nerve, and sometimes that was enough. She lined up the advancing infantry on her sensors, flicked a switch, and armed the smoke pods still strapped beneath her wings. Bright clouds burst over the enemy squads, blooming like angry red ghosts across the tree line. It wasn't firepower, but it was information. Every enemy position painted for the SEALs racing through the hills. Her coded markers would feed straight into their visors and tablets, a lifeline of clarity in a battlefield drowning in chaos. Grace skimmed the treetops again, throttling to maximum just as tracers erupted from a ridgeline. Bullets licked the sky, streaking close enough that her cockpit lit with fiery streaks. One round pinged against her undercarriage, ringing like a hammer on an anvil. She threw the plane into a corkscrew maneuver, gravity clawing at her ribs, breath squeezed from her chest. 0-1, break off! Riker's command cut through the static. She didn't answer. Breaking off wasn't an option. Her display showed the survivors' beacon still pulsing weakly. Echo Team had clustered near the wreck, their desperate movements clear even from altitude, but the enemy was moving faster. Columns were closing from the north and west, fanning into the trees. Grace cursed under her breath, sweat running into her eyes, and forced her aircraft lower than safety allowed. The world became a blur of green and brown. Tree limbs snapped against her wings. The smell of sap filled the cockpit. Her proximity alarms howled, but she shut them off, trusting her own hands over electronics. She carved a path directly between the enemy squads and the crash site, daring them to expose themselves. They did. Rifles flashed from cover, muzzle bursts lighting the undergrowth. She caught their positions instantly and tagged them, her sensors feeding the coordinates to the inbound SEAL unit. For every bullet that streaked toward her, she gave her ground brothers a precise mark to counter. The artillery shifted, new shells screeching through the sky. The first detonated only 50 yards from the wreck. The blast wave knocked survivors sprawling. Grace's stomach turned. If one shell hit center, the mission was finished before it even began. She pulled back on the stick, climbing sharply until her bird roared above the tree line. She needed to draw fire to split the enemy's focus. Sure enough, the radar warning flared again. Surface-to-air locks closed around her like chains. "Come on, look at me," she muttered, eyes narrowing. "Forget them. Look at me." Missiles streaked from the ridge. She rolled, dove, and dumped flares. Fiery decoys spat from her belly, splitting into blossoms that lured the missiles wide. One detonated in a brilliant orange bloom just behind her tail. The blast hurled the plane forward like a kicked toy, instruments flickering. Her chest slammed against the harness. Breath ripped from her lungs, but when the smoke cleared, she was still flying. Barely. 0-1 status. Riker again. Grace coughed, tasted blood in her mouth. Still operational. They're alive. Get your men in now. Through the haze, she caught movement on the eastern slope. Dark figures advancing in disciplined lines. It wasn't just militia anymore. These were trained troops, heavier, better armed. And they were converging fast. Her sensors lit again. Too many signatures, too close. "Echo team, this is 0-1, she called, voice steady despite the panic clawing inside her. "Hold tight, reinforcements are on the way. I won't let them close on you." The reply came broken, gasping, but fierce. "Copy, holding." Ammo nearly gone. Grace scanned the valley once more. Options dwindled. She had no weapons worth the name, only flares, smokes, and her own skill. But she did have the terrain. She angled her plane toward the north slope and dove headlong, hugging the cliff face so tightly that jagged rocks streaked inches from her wingtip. The enemy gunners above scrambled to track her. They turned their barrels down, exposing themselves just long enough for her to flare them. Another mark for the SEALs. Her comms crackled with a new voice. Riker. Closer now, his breathing heavy with exertion. 0-1. Ground team is in position. We're moving to your beacon. Relief swept her chest, fleeting but sharp. She banked wide to get eyes on them. Through the smoke she glimpsed dark shapes flowing over rocks, weapons raised, helmets gleaming faintly in filtered sunlight. The SEALs had arrived. She fed them data like a lifeline. Enemy squad West Ridge, 30 meters above tree line. Second squad pushing from north. Artillery repositioning. Expect impact in 60 seconds. Copy, Riker snapped. Keep their heads down. We'll grab the survivors. Grace dragged her plane across the valley again, swooping so low she could see terrified eyes staring up from the wreckage. She dipped her wings, a promise, then pulled hard toward the enemy's flank. Gunfire raked the air. A round smashed her right aileron, the plane jerking violently. She fought the stick, grunting, muscles straining. "Come on," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Stay with me." The aircraft wobbled but leveled. Below, the SEALs crashed into the clearing, smoke grenades blooming white around their advance. Echo teams stumbled toward them, limping, dragging each other. Grace circled above, eyes darting between the retreat and the enemy squads pressing in. She tagged every muzzle flash she saw, every movement in the tree line. Her screen lit up with hostile markers, but the SEALs used her intel like a scalpel, cutting through opposition before it could land a killing blow. The artillery fired again. This time the shells screamed directly toward the clearing. Grace's gut twisted. She had seconds. She shoved the throttle forward and dove straight into the trajectory. At the last instant she fired a full pod of flares, brilliant blossoms tearing across the sky. The heat signatures confused the targeting systems just enough. The shells detonated off course, pulverizing an empty ridge instead of the survivors. The concussion slammed her aircraft sideways. Warning lights exploded across her console, fuel pressure dropping. She barely kept the nose up, the world spinning in her canopy. 01, you just saved us a crater, Riker shouted. Extraction point secure. Get out before you burn in. But Grace wasn't finished. She circled one last time, watching until every survivor was hauled to his feet, until every SEAL had formed a perimeter. Only then did she pull her bird back toward open sky, engines coughing but still alive. Her vision swam, her arms trembled against the controls, but the valley was behind her and the mission was still breathing. The smell of cordite and burning earth clung to the valley long after the last shell fell silent. Grace pulled her crippled reconnaissance bird into a shallow climb, engines groaning like wounded animals. Her cockpit was hot, sweat stinging her eyes, warning lights blinking in an angry constellation across the panel. But she kept circling, refusing to leave until she knew the survivors were moving. Below, the SEALs fanned out through the shattered clearing. Riker's squad hauled Echo Team to their feet, rifles still barking as they carved a path through the smoke. One survivor staggered with a bloodied leg, another clutched his ribs as if holding himself together. Yet they moved, urged forward by the relentless momentum of men who had trained for years to run into hell and drag others back. 01, this is Riker. The radio cracked, his voice clipped but electric with determination. We've got all four. Heading to extraction corridor. Keep eyes on our flank. Grace thumbed the transmit switch, forcing her own exhaustion down. Copy. I've got you covered. Enemy forces still converging from the north slope. She swung her aircraft wide, sensors sweeping. Sure enough, a cluster of enemy blips moved fast along the ridgeline, leapfrogging from rock to rock. Through her canopy she caught glimpses, dark figures sprinting, muzzle flashes spitting toward the retreating SEALs. She marked them instantly, feeding data to Riker's visor. Contacts on your 2 o'clock, she warned. 15 meters above tree line, closing hard. Roger. His reply was immediate, followed by the dull chatter of suppressed fire. One by one, the enemy markers winked out as the SEALs cut them down with precision. Grace banked again, adrenaline surging. The valley was alive with violence, smoke still rising from artillery impacts, shattered trees leaning like broken spears, gunfire crackling like dry wood snapping. Her plane shuddered with every maneuver, the damaged stabilizer whining like a dying bird, but she ignored it. The mission hadn't ended at contact. The most dangerous part was always the withdrawal. She dipped lower, skimming the canopy. From this angle she could see the survivors' faces as they stumbled alongside their rescuers, dirt smeared, eyes wide with exhaustion and terror, but alive. That was enough to push her through the pain in her own chest. The enemy wasn't finished. Far from it. Her sensors flashed again, multiple heat signatures erupting on the valley's southern rim. Trucks, heavy guns, more infantry pouring into the fight. The insurgents had committed everything now, determined to cut off the rescue. Grace's gut clenched. There were too many. Command, this is 01, she called, voice tight. Enemy reinforcements inbound from the south, company strength at least. They'll intercept the team before they reach extraction. Dalton's reply was grim. We have no additional assets to divert. You'll need to hold them. Grace stared at the blinking signatures. Hold them? With what? Her bird carried no cannons, no missiles, only sensors, smoke pods, and a few flares. Yet those were the only tools left between Riker's men and annihilation. She banked hard and dove, heart-hammering, copy. Engaging with everything I have. The southern slope rushed up to meet her. Enemy trucks bounced across dirt roads, machine guns mounted in their beds already slewing upward. Grace slammed the throttles forward, engines screaming. She cut across them so low the gunners had to tilt their barrels nearly straight up, tracers streaking past her belly. She jinked left, released smoke in a sweeping arc, then pulled vertical, dragging the cloud like a curtain across the enemy column. The effect was immediate. The convoy screeched to a halt, blinded, choking in the dense red haze. Gunfire went wild, tracers burning useless holes in the mist. Grace's diversion bought Riker the minutes he needed, but her aircraft was paying for it. The strain of the climb rattled every rivet, alarms wailing. Her stabilizer groaned again, louder this time. She leveled just in time to see the valley floor tilt sideways from the damage. "Easy, girl," she whispered, coaxing the stick back to center. The plane wobbled, but it held. Below, the SEALs pressed through the tree line, Echo Team clinging to their shoulders. Gunfire echoed all around them, but their movements stayed sharp, controlled. Riker's voice cut across the channel again, raw with effort. 0-1, you've got enemy snipers lighting us up from the eastern cliffs. We need those suppressed now. Grace wheeled around, eyes scanning. She caught the glint of scopes on a jagged rise. Without hesitation, she dove, engines howling, canopy vibrating with the speed. She rolled the aircraft sideways, skimming the cliffs so close she could see startled faces staring up from their nests. She fired her last pod of smoke directly across their perch, blinding them in an instant. "Snipers neutralized," she called. "You're clear." "Affirmative," Riker replied, moving. The battle blurred into a rhythm of survival. Grace swooped, marked targets, drew fire. The SEALs pushed, fired, carried their charges. Every minute was purchased with sweat, with risk, with the constant grind of determination. Then the sky shifted. Dark clouds rolled over the peaks, blotting out the sun. Winds howled through the valleys, rattling trees like matchsticks. The meteorologists had warned of storms. Now they had arrived, sudden and merciless. Lightning split the horizon. Rain slashed across Grace's canopy, streaking in sheets that blurred her view. Instruments fuzzed with interference. Turbulence struck like invisible fists, hurling her bird sideways. "Command! Weather's closing in!" she shouted, gripping the stick with both hands, visibility dropping fast. Dalton's voice was harsh but steady. "Maintain your cover. Extraction depends on you." The storm became an enemy all its own. Grace fought the controls, arms trembling, as gusts hammered her aircraft, but she held on, dragging her eyes through the blur, searching for the team below. Through gaps in the canopy she saw them still moving. Riker's men bent against the rain, hauling Echo Team toward the extraction zone. Every instinct screamed to pull back, to climb above the weather, to save herself, but she shoved the thought down. Her mission wasn't survival, it was guardianship. She dropped even lower, weaving between jagged ridges now half-shrouded in mist. The turbulence threatened to smash her into stone, but she clung to the stick, coaxing, demanding. Her teeth ground together as another warning siren wailed, "Fuel." The needle hovered near the red. The storm was killing her fuel efficiency. She'd barely have enough to reach base if she kept this up. Grace made her decision. She pressed the comms, voice hard as iron. 0-1 to command. "I'll stay with them until extraction. Don't expect me back on time." There was silence, then Riker's voice broke through, fierce with respect. "Copy that, Grace. We'll get them out. You just keep those bastards off us." She gritted her teeth and dove once more, engines roaring against the storm. Below, the enemy pressed harder, determined to finish what they started. But each time they closed, Grace was there, smoke across their rifles, flares drawing their fire, her presence slicing through the storm like a promise. The mission wasn't over. The hardest part still lay ahead. The storm did not relent. Sheets of rain hammered Grace's canopy so thick the outside world blurred into grey curtains. Every instrument blinked with warning lights, and the horizon vanished into a chaos of wind, water, and jagged stone. Her reconnaissance bird shuddered as if a giant hand tried to tear it from the sky. She fought the controls, muscles burning with the constant corrections required to keep the aircraft steady. The damaged stabilizer groaned with every gust, threatening to shear off completely. Still, she stayed low, shadowing the SEAL's progress beneath the canopy. If they were climbing through hell, then she would fly through it too. Riker's voice punched through the static. 01, we're a click from the extraction point, but hostiles are on our tail. Need eyes now. Grace squinted through the storm. Her sensors flickered with intermittent contacts, rain interfering with the readings. But she caught enough. Heat blooms chasing the SEALs, more squads moving fast to cut them off. She slammed the throttle, diving closer to the valley floor, nearly scraping treetops that writhed like waves under the gale. Contacts at your 6, she called, her voice clipped but firm. Multiple squads closing, another element attempting to flank from East Ridge, marking now. Her smoke pods were gone, her tools nearly exhausted, but she had one advantage left, the storm itself. Grace banked, dragging her bird into the sheets of rain. She cut her engines down just enough that her silhouette blended with the thunder, then swept low over the pursuing force. The insurgents looked up, guns raised, but what they saw was only a shadow slicing across the storm. Their gunfire went wild, tracers vanishing into the downpour. Her maneuver bought seconds. That was all the SEALs needed. She heard their gunfire rise, sharp and controlled, cutting down the first line of pursuit. 01, we see your marks, Riker said, his voice steady even in the chaos. Push them back again, we're almost there. Grace banked again, but the turbulence caught her mid-turn. The plane lurched sideways, lightning crackling so close it lit the cockpit white. Warning alarms shrieked, hydraulic pressure falling, systems overloaded. For a moment she thought the controls would lock completely. She slammed her palm against the panel, coaxing the bird like a stubborn animal. Stay with me, damn it. Just a little longer. The plane shuddered but leveled. Grace dragged in a breath, knuckles white against the stick. She forced her focus back to the mission, her eyes sweeping the terrain below. Through the storm, she glimpsed a rocky plateau ahead, the designated extraction zone. Even in the deluge, she could see the flat expanse was already compromised. Enemy fighters had beaten them there, setting up machine guns behind makeshift barricades. Her stomach tightened. If the SEALs walked into that kill zone, none of them would walk out. Riker, extraction is hot, she warned. Multiple hostiles entrenched. You'll be cut apart if you go straight in. What's your play? His question wasn't doubt. It was trust. Grace's mind raced. She had no weapons, no ordnance to clear the plateau, but she did have her aircraft, her wits, and the storm. Give me 60 seconds, she said, then hit the zone. Without waiting for reply, she shoved the throttle and angled the nose up, climbing into the storm clouds. Rain hammered the fuselage harder, turbulence threatening to rip her apart, but she needed altitude. Her plan was reckless, bordering on suicidal. She didn't care. The bird clawed upward through the grey until lightning swallowed her view. She felt the static charge in her teeth, the prickling sensation that meant electricity was ready to arc. At the peak of the climb, she cut the throttles back and nosed over, diving toward the plateau. Her altimeter spun wildly. Wind screamed against the canopy. The plateau rushed up to meet her, the enemy fighters looking up in sudden panic. Grace armed her last set of flares and dumped them all at once. Dozens of burning comets streaked through the storm, trailing fire and smoke. To the fighters below, it looked like the heavens had opened, raining fire straight down on their position. Chaos erupted, men scattering, gunfire ceasing as panic seized them. Grace kept the dive steady until the last possible second, then pulled hard, engines roaring in protest. The aircraft skimmed the plateau, rain blasting from its wings before she clawed back into the sky. "Zone is clear enough," she gasped into the mic. "Go now!" Riker's voice snapped back on it. "Move, move, move!" From above, Grace watched the SEALs break through the tree line, survivors stumbling between them. They surged across the plateau, firing controlled bursts into the scattered hostiles who hadn't fled. Gunfire sparked in the storm, but the team cut a path with ruthless efficiency. Within moments, they had secured the zone. 01, this is Riker. Survivors secure. Bird inbound. Grace felt a flood of relief wash over her, but it lasted only a second. Her radar screamed again, multiple locks from the southern slope. Enemy reinforcements weren't giving up. They had tracked her through the storm, and now surface-to-air batteries were alive again, missiles primed. "Command, we're about to get boxed," she reported, forcing calm into her voice. "Extraction bird needs cover, or it'll never make it in." Dalton's tone was grim. 01, you are the cover. She swallowed hard. She had nothing left but herself. Her sensors confirmed 3 missile launches. She slammed the stick into a roll, dumping chaff and flares, but she had used most of her countermeasures. The missiles adjusted, hunting her heat signature through the rain. Grace shoved the throttle forward, heart pounding, forcing the damaged plane into a climb so violent her vision tunneled. She cut left, dove, then rolled again, flares spitting behind her. The first missile exploded in the rain, close enough to rattle her bird. The second screamed past, confused by her maneuvers. The third stayed locked. Her console shrieked, impact inevitable. At the last second, she yanked her nose toward the mountainside, skimming so close the cliff face filled her canopy. The missile followed, blind with hunger. She cut power, dropped flares, then pulled up with every ounce of strength she had. The missile slammed into the rock behind her, detonating in a thunderclap that shook the valley. Debris hammered her fuselage, spider cracks racing across the canopy, but she was still alive. 01, this is Riker. Extraction bird is on final. We're loading now. Grace wheeled around, straining to see through the storm. A dark silhouette broke through the clouds, a heavy transport helicopter, rotors slicing the rain. It descended toward the plateau, SEALs waving survivors aboard. Enemy fire opened up again, rifles and machine guns barking from every direction. The plateau erupted in sparks as rounds clanged against stone. The transport hovered dangerously vulnerable. Grace knew she had one pass left in her. She lined up on the enemy's strongest flank, dropped low, and roared past at treetop height. Her engines blasted sheets of rain into the fighters' faces, her silhouette so close they scattered in shock. It wasn't firepower, but it was disruption. It was enough. The SEALs bundled the last survivor aboard. Riker was the last up, leaping onto the skid as the transport lifted. 01, we're clear, he shouted. Get yourself out of here! But Grace's gauges told a harsher truth. Her fuel needle kissed empty, and her engines coughed with each surge. The battered bird had nothing left to give. She banked one final time, watching the transport vanish into the storm with its precious cargo. Relief swelled in her chest, mingled with exhaustion so deep it felt like gravity. Alone in the storm, alarms screaming, Grace whispered to her aircraft, "Just get me home. That's all I ask." The storm had not loosened its grip. Grace's reconnaissance bird clawed through the grey like a battered hawk, wings trembling under the strain. The extraction helicopter was gone now, swallowed into clouds with Echo Team aboard. Her task should have been finished, but the sky refused to release her. Fuel gauges lay buried in the red, warning sirens droned in a maddening chorus, a reminder that every second she remained airborne was borrowed time. She could already feel the engines stuttering, coughing like lungs drowning in water. 01, this is Red Haven Command. Dalton's voice broke through the static, terse but urgent. Transport has cleared the storm front. Survivors are safe. Your priority is returning alive. Grace stared at the cracked canopy where rain lashed in endless sheets. Alive. That was a luxury she wasn't sure she had left. Copy, Command, she answered, attempting egress. She angled her bird northwest, aiming for the narrow valley that would lead her back toward friendly skies, but the storm had other plans. Wind slammed the fuselage broadside, shoving her off course toward cliffs jagged enough to tear her apart. She fought the stick, muscles screaming, trying to keep her craft level. Then her radar lit again, contacts fast-moving, approaching from the south. She cursed under her breath. The enemy wasn't done. Fighters had been scrambled, prowling through the storm like wolves hunting a wounded deer. 2 signatures, 1 mile and closing. Grace's stomach tightened. Her reconnaissance plane had no air-to-air missiles, no cannons, nothing but agility, terrain, and her will to live. And now, even those advantages were fading. Command, be advised. She forced the words past clenched teeth. Hostile aircraft closing on me. I'll try to evade, but I'm out of countermeasures. Dalton's reply was sharp. 01, do not engage. Get clear. She almost laughed at the order, as if disengagement was an option. Through the storm, she caught the first flicker of navigation lights, 2 dark silhouettes slicing through the rain. They split immediately, one climbing, one diving, boxing her in. Grace yanked the stick, dropping low to hug the valley floor, hoping the terrain would hide her. Trace of fire lit the storm, brilliant orange lances cutting past her canopy. The roar of engines chased her, closer, closer. She threw her bird into a hard roll, skimming a cliff face so tight her wingtip clipped loose rock that shattered in her wake. Stay with me, she whispered to the aircraft, coaxing like it could hear. One more fight. The lead hostile dove in, gunfire stitching across the sky. Bullets slammed into her right wing, sparks bursting across metal. Warning lights flared, hydraulics failing. The stick resisted her pull like dead weight. She grunted, forcing it with both hands, sweat slick on her palms. She banked left, straight into the teeth of the storm. Lightning flashed, illuminating the canyon ahead. It wasn't a corridor, it was a coffin, walls of stone narrowing to a razor slit. To survive, she would have to fly through. Her breath caught, but hesitation wasn't an option. She leveled her wings and drove straight in. The canyon swallowed her. Rain turned to knives against the canopy, wind shrieking through the narrow gap. She threaded between walls of stone, less than 10 feet to spare on either side. Behind her, the pursuing fighters hesitated. One tried to follow, its bulk too heavy, scraping the canyon wall in a spray of sparks before erupting in a fireball. The blast rocked Grace's aircraft, but she pressed on, one down, one still on her tail. The second enemy pilot was skilled, hugging the canyon entrance before banking overhead, trying to cut her off at the far side. Grace's eyes flicked to her fuel gauge, needle sinking lower still. She had minutes, maybe less, before the engines flamed out. The canyon spat her into open sky again, but the storm was waiting, black and furious. The second fighter swooped in, guns flaring. She jerked her bird into a desperate climb, engines screaming. Tracers ripped past her belly, one tearing a groove along her tail. Her vision tunneled with G-forces, black creeping at the edges. She forced herself to breathe, dragging air into her lungs, fighting to stay conscious. "Command, I can't outrun him," she hissed, voice strained. "Options?" Dalton's reply came after a long pause. "Terrain west of you, sharp ridges, unpredictable wind currents. No pilot would risk them." Grace almost smiled. "Then that's exactly where I'm going." She rolled hard, banking west into the storm's heart. Lightning flashed in jagged arcs, illuminating ridgelines that jutted like knives. The winds there were infamous, currents so violent they had torn apart entire aircraft. But it was also the only place her smaller, battered bird could maneuver where the heavier fighter could not. The hostile followed, unwilling to lose the kill. Grace felt the turbulence seize her plane, hurling it sideways like a toy. She fought back, every muscle quivering. The storm buffeted both aircraft, lightning cracking so close it painted the cockpit white. Then Grace saw it, an updraft, a column of violent air spiraling off the ridge. If she hit it just right, it might sling her upward, out of the fighter's sights, or it might tear her wings clean off. "Here we go," she muttered, gripping the stick. She aimed directly into the maelstrom, throttles wide. The updraft caught her like a giant hand, hurling the reconnaissance plane skyward. Gravity crushed her into the seat, vision blurring, alarms screaming. For a moment she thought the wings would snap, metal groaning with impossible strain. But the bird held. She rocketed above the ridgeline, bursting out of the storm into a rare pocket of clear sky. The hostile fighter wasn't so lucky. It hit the edge of the current, overcorrected, and slammed into the mountainside in a bloom of fire. Grace sagged against her harness, chest heaving. Both fighters destroyed, not by her firepower, but by her refusal to yield. Her relief was short-lived. The climb had cost her the last of her fuel. The engine sputtered, coughed, then began to die. One by one, the systems winked out, leaving her with nothing but wind howling through dead turbines. She was gliding now, powerless, storm clouds curling back around her. "Command," she said quietly into her mic. "This is 01. Engines out. I'm dead stick." Static filled the channel. She didn't know if they heard. She forced her eyes ahead, scanning for any sign of ground she could survive landing on. Through the storm she caught sight of a narrow plateau, half swallowed by trees, just wide enough for a crash attempt. It was miles from base, deep in contested territory, but it was all she had. She trimmed the plane, coaxing every ounce of lift from the battered wings. Rain streaked across the canopy like claws. Her hands trembled, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm, but she held steady. The plateau loomed closer. Trees whipped past. Her landing gear refused to deploy, hydraulics dead. She'd have to skid it in belly first. "Stay together," she whispered to the aircraft, "just a little longer." The ground surged up. She flared the nose, heart hammering. Metal screamed as the belly of the plane tore across rock and mud. Sparks burst, smoke billowed, pieces of wing sheared away. She was thrown forward against the harness, teeth rattling. Then silence. The aircraft lay broken, smoke curling from its wounds. Grace's vision swam, her body screaming with pain, but she was alive. Barely. She forced trembling hands to release the harness and pushed the canopy open. Rain poured in, soaking her instantly. She dragged herself free, boots sinking into mud, lungs heaving ragged breaths. In the distance, thunder rolled again, not just the storm, but artillery. The enemy was still out there, and now she was on foot behind their lines. Grace staggered upright, blood running down her temple, and looked toward the horizon where lightning split the sky. The mission wasn't over. For her, it had only changed shape. The wreck smoked behind her like a funeral pyre. Grace limped away from the shattered reconnaissance plane, every step a war between will and pain. Her flight suit was torn at the knee, blood running into her boot. Her ribs ached from the crash harness, and her left arm tingled as if it belonged to someone else. The plateau stretched out into a wet expanse of stone and mud, hemmed by black forest. The storm hadn't lifted. Rain poured down in unbroken sheets, lightning stabbing at the horizon. Each flash illuminated the wreck behind her, a beacon to anyone watching. She couldn't stay. The enemy would be drawn like wolves to fire. Her radio hissed faintly. The antenna had snapped, the casing cracked. but when she pressed the transmit button, static spilled across her ears. 01, alive, crash landed. Her voice faded in the storm. No response. She was cut off. Grace swallowed hard and forced her mind to focus. Survive first. Evade second. Then signal home. She slid down the slope into the tree line, boots squelching in mud. The canopy swallowed her, muting the storm to a muffled roar. She moved with deliberate steps, remembering the SEAL training modules she'd studied long ago, the lessons that most pilots only skimmed. Cover your tracks, break your pattern, listen before you move. The forest smelled of rotten rain. Branches clawed at her flight suit, every scratch reminding her how exposed she was. She found a cluster of rocks and crouched low, forcing her breath to slow. Voices drifted through the storm, harsh, guttural, carried by men who knew the terrain. Grace froze. The enemy was already here. Flashlights cut through the rain, sweeping across tree trunks. She could see 4 of them through the undergrowth, rifles ready, moving in disciplined arcs. They weren't amateurs, they were hunting. Grace pressed herself into the mud, heart slamming against her ribs. The beam of a flashlight passed within feet of her boots, lingering on the ground. One of the soldiers bent low, touching the wet soil. He said something in his tongue, then gestured toward the plateau. They would find the wreck soon, and then they'd widen their search. Grace crawled backward, careful to avoid breaking branches. Her left arm screamed with every motion, but she bit down on the pain. Inch by inch, she retreated deeper into the forest until the voices faded behind her. She needed to move north, toward the extraction corridor Riker's men had used. If she could reach that path, maybe she'd cross friendly patrols. But it was miles away, through storm, enemy patrols, and terrain that would chew her alive if she misstepped. Grace kept moving. Hours bled together. The storm raged overhead, turning the forest floor into rivers of mud. Grace staggered through ravines, climbed over slick boulders, and waded through waist-deep water that froze her bones. Every sound carried. Her breathing, the slosh of water, the crack of branches. She forced herself to stop often, to listen. Twice she heard voices again. Once she spotted the glow of a campfire through the trees. Each time she veered wide, heart hammering, body screaming for rest. At one point she stumbled into a clearing where artillery fragments had chewed the ground into black craters. Shattered helmets and twisted rifles lay half buried in the mud, relics of a fight no one had survived. She forced her eyes away. Dwelling on ghosts wouldn't keep her alive. Her stomach twisted with hunger. She had no rations, only a survival kit clipped to her suit. She tore it open under a fallen log, finding a foil packet of water purifier, a signal mirror, and a combat knife. No food, no flares, bare minimum. Grace tilted her head back and let the rain fill her mouth. It wasn't enough, but it steadied her throat. By nightfall, or what passed for night under storm clouds, her strength faltered. She found a hollow beneath the roots of a massive tree and dragged herself inside. The mud sucked at her boots as she collapsed, curling around her aching ribs. For a long moment she stared at the dark. The storm muffled overhead and let her eyes close. Sleep came jagged, broken by thunder and distant shouts. She dreamed of the cockpit lights winking out, of tracer fire clawing at her canopy, of the moment she chose to dive into the canyon. Each dream ended with the crash, her body jolting awake. At dawn the storm broke. Clouds thinned into mist, sunlight bleeding through in pale bands. The forest glittered with dew, but the air was heavy with tension. Grace crawled from the hollow, her body stiff, mud caked across her uniform. She stretched, winced, and listened. Gunfire cracked somewhere in the distance. Not a skirmish, controlled bursts, disciplined. Seals. Hope flared in her chest. She started toward the sound. Careful but faster now, urgency propelling her through the brush. Then voices rose ahead. Enemy closer than she expected. She crouched behind a fallen tree just as a squad of 6 appeared, rifles slung, eyes scanning. They moved with precision, not the reckless confidence of militia, professionals. Her pulse thundered. She was unarmed, exhausted, half-broken. Facing them was suicide, but if they reached the SEALs first, her allies might walk into an ambush. Her hand drifted to the combat knife. Slim, utilitarian, hardly comfort against rifles. Still, it was steel, and steel was better than nothing. She waited until the squad passed her position, mud squelching under their boots. She rose into a crouch, silent as she could manage, and trailed them through the undergrowth. Every step was agony, but she matched their pace, her eyes locked on the last man in line. When the squad paused at a rise to survey the valley, Grace moved. She lunged, clamped a hand over the rear soldier's mouth, and drove the knife under his collarbone. His body jerked once, then sagged. She eased him down into the brush, praying the storm muffled the sound. Her hands trembled as she wiped the blade against her suit. Killing on the ground was different than firing from a cockpit. Up close, it left its weight in your bones. She shoved the thought aside. No time. She crept forward, eyes scanning for the rest of the squad. They had spread out across the ridge, overlooking a valley where smoke still curled from the previous day's battle. Grace froze, watching as they set up tripods and optics. They weren't just hunting, they were coordinating, directing reinforcements. Grace swallowed hard. She couldn't take them all, but maybe she didn't have to. She slipped back into the trees, circled wide, and found a position where sunlight pierced the canopy. From her kit, she pulled the small signal mirror, cracked but intact. She angled it toward the valley, flashing short bursts in the direction of the gunfire she'd heard earlier. SEALs knew the code. Enemy spotters didn't. She prayed they'd see. Minutes crawled. The squad below barked into radios, pointing toward the valley. Then gunfire erupted, sharp, precise, too close to be coincidence. The SEALs had read her signal. Their ambush struck with surgical force, cutting the squad down before they could even respond. Grace sagged against the tree, relief flooding her. She was still behind enemy lines, battered and alone, but she had tipped the scale, even if only slightly. Her radio crackled faintly, startling her. She raised it to her ear. 01, this is Riker. If you're alive, signal. We're searching. Her throat tightened. She pressed transmit. 01, alive. Coordinates to follow. Low strength. Static swallowed her. Then his voice again. Hold tight. We'll find you. Grace closed her eyes for a second, letting herself breathe. She wasn't safe yet. But for the first time since the crash, she wasn't invisible. The forest still seethed with danger. Patrols still combed the ridges. But somewhere out there, her allies were moving toward her, guided by fragments of signal, and the knowledge that she refused to fall quietly. The mission wasn't over. Not until she was back on friendly soil. The forest felt alive with pursuit. Grace leaned against a tree trunk, lungs dragging in ragged air. Her legs trembled, boots caked in mud, but she forced herself onward. Every pause risked being the last. The static in her radio had gone silent again, leaving her with only the drum of her pulse and the whisper of rain dripping from leaves. Somewhere to the north, the SEALs were closing. She trusted Riker's word. If he said they'd find her, they would, but trust didn't keep her alive in the meantime. She had to keep moving, keep out of sight. A branch snapped. Grace dropped into a crouch, knife in hand, every sense sharpened. Figures moved between the trees, silhouettes half hidden by mist. Too many for her to fight. She slid into the brush, pressing her body flat against the wet earth. The patrol passed close enough that she caught their smell. Oil, sweat, cordite, their boots squelched in rhythm, rifles ready, eyes cutting through the trees. She held her breath until her chest ached, mud soaking into every seam of her flight suit. One soldier paused, head cocking. He scanned the ground and the brush. His light swept inches from her face. Grace gripped the knife so tightly her hand trembled. If he leaned closer, if he spotted the faint rise of her breath, it would end here. A shout echoed from deeper in the forest. The soldier turned, muttered something, and moved on. Grace exhaled silently, her body shaking from the near miss. She crawled backward, using roots for cover, and forced herself upright again. Every instinct screamed that the net was tightening. If she stayed, they'd corner her. She had to risk the ridge. The climb was brutal. Slippery stone, roots twisting like claws, mud pulling at her boots. Her arms burned, ribs stabbed with every motion. Twice she slipped, sliding back feet before catching herself on jagged rock. But she kept climbing, driven by the faint memory of Riker's voice promising they'd find her. At the crest, she pulled herself onto her stomach and lay still. From here, the forest stretched in every direction, mist curling through trees like ghosts. She spotted movement on a parallel ridge, another patrol, rifles scanning, methodical. They were everywhere. Grace pressed her radio again. 01, position high ridge, overlooking valley, fuel wreck north. Anyone copy? Static answered, then faint but clear. 01, this is Riker. Signal weak, but we've got you. Hold position, we're inbound, 20 minutes. Her chest loosened, a thin thread of hope weaving through exhaustion. 20 minutes. She just had to survive that long. She crawled deeper into the ridge brush, using fallen logs as cover. Her knife rested against her thigh, her survival kit clutched tight. 20 minutes. It didn't take long for the enemy to notice. Shouts rose from below, beams of light cutting through the mist. They were sweeping the ridge, triangulating her position. Grace's pulse pounded. She had no weapon but the knife. Running would expose her. Staying risked being overrun. She glanced at the shattered mirror shard still in her kit, the same one she'd used to signal the SEALs. An idea sparked. She angled the shard toward a break in the canopy, catching what little sunlight leaked through. She flashed 3 bursts, short, sharp, then a pause, a warning, a lure. The patrol below spotted the glint instantly. They shouted, guns raising, and surged toward the false position. Grace slid silently the other way, belly to the ground, mud smearing across her cheek. She crawled until her arms shook, until her chest screamed for air. Gunfire erupted. The SEALs had arrived. Sharp, disciplined bursts cracked from the opposite ridge. Grace lifted her head, heart racing. Figures moved through the mist, black-clad, rifles steady, advancing with lethal precision. Enemy soldiers fell one by one, their shouts strangled by the storm of fire. 01, this is Riker. The radio burst alive. Stronger now. We see you. Hold your position. We're cutting through. Grace almost laughed in relief, though her throat was too raw for sound. She waved a hand weakly from behind her log, then dropped flat again as bullets whined past. The firefight was chaos. Enemy forces pouring toward her ridge, SEALs carving them down. Then a voice thundered nearby, guttural and commanding. Grace twisted to see a heavy-set enemy officer rallying his men, directing fire toward her cover. Bullets shredded bark inches from her head. If they overran her position before the SEALs reached her, she was finished. Her hand tightened on the knife. No, not like this. She crawled toward the edge of the log, teeth gritted, and hurled the shard of mirror into the open. It flashed once, twice, drawing fire. She rolled the other way, sprinting on shaking legs toward a boulder. Gunfire chased her, dirt exploding at her heels, but she dove behind cover before the storm of bullets could find flesh. "Grace, hold on!" Riker's voice roared. Moments later, the SEALs surged over the ridge, their rifles hammered, grenades arcing into the enemy line. The officer shouted one last command before a burst cut him down mid-word. The rest broke, scattering into the trees. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of rain and the rasp of Grace's breath. Boots pounded toward her. A shadow loomed, then a hand clamped her shoulder. Riker's face appeared, helmet streaked with mud, eyes blazing. "Got you," he said simply. Grace sagged, every ounce of tension bleeding from her body. For the first time since the crash, she wasn't alone. The SEALs formed a perimeter, weapons scanning the trees. One of them handed Grace a canteen, another steadied her arm. She drank greedily, water washing mud from her lips. "We've got a bird waiting past the ridge," Riker said. "Can you move?" Grace nodded, though her body screamed otherwise. "I didn't come this far to stop now." Together, they pushed through the forest, SEALs guarding every flank. Gunfire crackled in the distance, but none came close. Grace stumbled often, but strong hands caught her each time. The ridge gave way to a clearing where a helicopter crouched, rotors chopping the mist. Riker lifted her aboard himself. The crew chief slammed the door, and the bird lifted. As the ground fell away, Grace pressed her forehead against the cold metal wall, eyes closing. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin there was only breath, heartbeat, and the faint hum of safety. The mission was over. When the blades carried Grace out of hostile ground, she didn't see victory in terms of medals or rank. She saw 4 rescued survivors, a team that never gave up on her, and an aircraft that had given everything until its last breath. Her story isn't just about a daring flight or a brutal crash. It's about resolve in the face of impossible odds. About staying in the fight when the fuel is gone, the sky is burning, and the storm won't break. It's about proving that courage doesn't depend on what you fly or what weapon you carry. It comes from the decision to keep going when retreat feels easier. The mission showed us something greater than one pilot's skill. It revealed the power of trust. Riker's SEALs fought with the certainty that somewhere above, Grace was carving a path for them. And Grace flew into fire, knowing that on the ground there were men risking everything to bring their brothers home. That bond, that unspoken promise, is why they all survived. For us watching, it leaves a question hanging in the air. What would we do when everything is against us, when there's no guarantee of making it out? Would we hold steady the way she did and push through the storm? At VeteranBiker, we tell these stories not just to honor the past, but to remind ourselves of what grit and sacrifice look like. If Grace's fight meant something to you, let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts, your questions, or even where you were watching from. We want to hear your voice. Thank you for being here. Don't forget to subscribe to VeteranBiker for more stories like this one. And stay tuned. The next mission is already waiting for you on the screen.